Since fear seems to be the predominant emotion, it's worth examining, in my opinion, some of our most common fears around money. So that's what we're going to do today. Welcome to Make Your Money Matter. I'm your host, Brad Barrett. I'm also a managing director and partner here at One Capital Management. I'm here each and every week to help you better understand your finances and navigate your investing journey because, after all, your money matters. Now, for many of you who've been watching and listening, I'm somewhat of a nerd when it comes to the psychology of money. In fact, we did an entire episode dedicated to it. But I wanted to dedicate this week's show to a recent article I was reading by a guy named Daniel Crosby. He's a doctor of psychology, and he actually had a lot of points to make around how we perceive the most important things in our life. And I would argue, as many of you watching and listening right now would probably argue as well, that money is a very important thing to all of us. Now, mind you, something you've heard me bring up before is the 1 Timothy 6:10, money is the root of all evil. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. So money itself, as I stated before, is neither good or bad. It's what you do with it that matters. And although it is a necessity in life, it does not need to be your end-all be-all. In fact, it shouldn't be. And this is where many people get fearful when it comes to money, which we're going to talk about today. So either fear, when I talk about fear, either fear of running out of money or fear of not having enough, more the inadequacy a part of our psychology. But before I dig in through this article and I bring up this topic I mentioned, be sure to smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. All right, let's get into it. So as you can probably hear, I had the flu a couple weeks ago, and for some reason my head is just not draining it. So if I sound a little nasally, that's still why. This article I mentioned was, again, written by a guy named Daniel Crosby. He actually wrote the article in Kiplinger around a psychologist, around the fear-fighting tips for investors. And I talk about these often in my practice, and I wanted to bring this up here. So I wanted to focus on that today because I think now, more than ever, given what we've gone through in this year, but also the past 2 years around the pandemic, the inflation concerns, the recession talks, all stuff, again, that we've talked about here. And I've spoken about, all of this with my clients in our review meetings. And if you're not a client and you're listening to this, make sure you are having this discussion, by the way, with your advisor, because to make good financial decisions, you need a clear head. And the one thing that can get in the way of a clear head is fear. I want to be very clear about something, and I know this is going to be a little bit biblical, but hear me out. Fear comes from the devil. It doesn't come from God. God doesn't instill fear in you. The worry, by the way, comes from fear. The root of worry is fear. Now, a couple weeks ago, I mentioned this too, and I want to focus on this as it gets into the psychology here that we're going to be talking about. But, there's a difference between worry and concern. Worry leads us to inaction. It causes us to think about, and almost too much so, think about the things that we can't control. Whereas concern is a God-given intuition that allows us and leads us typically to action. So we want to be first define fear and where it comes from and really focus on it because we don't want it to hinder us because fear is debilitating. We know what it stands for, right? Forget everything and run. There's other vernaculars for it too. But when it comes to our money, we can't do that. In fact, I'd probably suggest that's the last thing you want to do. And as I've stated before about trying to time the market or letting fear-driven selling, like what you might be feeling this year, drive, what you are doing with your investment plan. Because, and most of you know that I'm a big hockey fan. For those of you who don't, I'm a big hockey fan. There are 32 teams in the National Hockey League. And my son Brooks, who's showing some interest in hockey, which I'm kind of stoked for, wants to get into a league. And we were watching a game, but we were talking about it. And I go, hey, Brooks, what's the difference between a team in the NHL winning the Stanley Cup versus the team that ends dead last? Now, mind you, I'm talking to a 7-year-old here, so his answers were somewhat ridiculous. But in that conversation, I want to actually bring that up on today's show because the difference between a team winning a championship versus coming in dead last is not necessarily the goal. Because the goal for every person, everyone listening here, for your finances is to get your finances in order and have a successful financial life. That's the goal. So you do the things you want to do. Maybe it's managing debt. it all has to do with the financial discussion, ultimately into retirement, but it's also about living a happy and healthy retirement. And to a sports team, in my analogy, the goal is the same. It's to win the cup or win the championship. So what's the difference? It's the systems. It's the discipline you put in place. Fear can derail a lot of the strategy you put together. Now, look, there's no shame, by the way, shame in being scared. I mean, look, that's a part of our brain's design, is to help protect us. That's called discernment. The 2 Ds I talk about, discipline and discernment. So there's nothing wrong about being scared, but fears become problematic when it paralyzes us or stands in our way. Now, even just thinking about something positive, for example, activates our internal reward system, which honestly can lead to increased risk, taking increased impulsivity, greater general or physical arousal. However, if you think about it, fear understandably has the opposite effect of those things, making us timid, protective, and more risk adverse, both positive and negative emotions. So some of these aspects of fear can come into play to help you. Some can actually come into play and hurt you if they're taken to the extremes. That's such as life, as everything in life that happens that way, right? They all can hamper, I think, a sound financial decision-making. But remember, since fear seems to be the predominant emotion, it's worth examining, in my opinion, some of our most common fears around money. So that's what we're gonna do today. So let's talk about 3 common fears most of us have struggled with, okay? Fear of missing out, or in the vernacular of the younger crowd, FOMO. Then there's fear of volatility, and then ultimately fear of uncertainty. So let's take the first one for a second. Fear of missing out. And let's just call it, look, fear of missing out and the anxiety around not being a part of, let's say, a market upswing. This can lead to excessive risk taking. Think about that for a second. You don't want to miss the upswing. Someone talks to you about, maybe a company, a lot of it's been the pocket investments nowadays, like the Peloton, the Zoom, the Teslas, right? Those kind of things that come up at water cooler conversations. And you're like, oh man, the fear of missing out on that upswing and have my buddy be right there and I just missed out on it, but he's doing great, can actually create anxiety and actually lead you to maybe having an excessive risk taking. Like maybe that's not for you, but you think you need it because he has it. So that's one thing to consider as the FOMO of the fears that we have. The second item I brought up is the fear of volatility. Now, this I can describe as the discomfort, I'll say, with the ups and downs that are really inherent in capital markets that can lead to the extreme other side, excessive conservatism. Now, this year is a great year to talk about this second one, obviously, because we've had a lot of volatility. So if I'm speaking to someone right now who's watching or listening right now, really ask yourself and be candid and honest. Is this you? Is this fear of volatility leading you to be overly conservative and really get you out of what your true financial plan is? So one fear of missing out can lead to excessive risk taking. And then the fear of volatility, the second one I'm bringing up, the discomforts of the ups and downs, can actually lead you to excessive conservatism. Am I striking a chord with anyone? I want to bring up a couple here today that I think might be pertinent, okay? If I'm not, you're probably a robot, because every human listening has felt these emotions before, okay? And the third one I want to bring up is the fear of uncertainty. And I think probably now more than ever before, especially from the past 2 years, not knowing what will happen is the fear of uncertainty. This leads to 2 common behaviors that I've seen. And this was actually detailed in research by Daniel Crosby, the writer of this article. And he mentioned these 2 things, these 2 common behaviors that fear of uncertainty can lead to compensatory overconfidence or assuming the worst. Now, neither of which leads to great financial choices. I'll just say that out of the gate. So to help us all overcome the fears that can hold us back financially, let's talk about a few tips that I've learned over the past 20 years. Okay, first and foremost, we need to learn from your fears. You probably heard that before, all right, maybe from your parents or grandparents or a good coach. Learn from your fears. Realize that some amount of fear and stress can be beneficial. That is true. That's how God designed us. I mean, our brain is designed to give us discerning factors. That's a good thing. Fear in moderate doses can instruct us to better prepare us for uncertain futures. Let me give you an example. I have 2 kids, Brooks and Kate. And anyone who's a parent or grandparent understands this notion. We learn fear at early ages. But I'm bringing this up because we have to actually instill some healthy fears. And one of the lessons I bring up to my daughter, who is very different than my son, she is fearless by nature, and we have to bring these up for regards to her safety. I said to her recently, remember when you're walking across the street and you don't look for cars? I mean, that should be a healthy fear. She asked why, and I answered, well, because if the car hits you, that's not good. And believe it or not, we learn this basic notion that we all know nowadays at early stages. That fear, once we realize what it is, can instruct us to do better and prepare us for uncertain futures. The uncertainty of looking around a corner, crossing a street, not seeing a car, you're prepared because you now know you're going to look no matter what. Let me give you another example. An appropriate fear of death or disability might lead someone to protect their assets with insurance. I see a lot of that in my world. Now, the fear that a single company or country might underperform might rightly lead someone to diversify their assets. That's a good thing. Again, I'm using some financial examples here. So fear isn't all bad as long as it's healthy. So protection for someone who's fearful of loss makes sense. That's where you insure the risk. But here's the thing. We must first ask ourselves if there is something in us. This fear can be teaching us. What can this fear we might have be teaching us? So number one, we want to learn from our fears. And then number two, which really dovetails off number one, is to face them. You know, this again, the old 90s posters, right? Face your fears, right? But it's really important. The paradox of fear is that to overcome a fear, you must actually confront it. Because avoiding, like, for example, seemingly innocuous situations like maybe a fearful conversation for those like my wife, I love you dearly, Veronica, but she's not a huge fan of awkward conversations. She doesn't like to have them. But avoiding them or the feelings that they give can be, really can give them more power than they actually have, which is why 90% of those with specific phobias are actually cured by facing their fears, if you look at studies. But I think anyone listening who's lived on this earth long enough knows that that just makes sense. We have to face our fear because a lot of times, sometimes you realize, it wasn't that bad. How many times did that happen in your life? Or like think of a kid on a roller coaster, right? Everyone's doing it around it. It's this huge theme park. It's a great example, right? I don't want to go on that. That looks scary. Well, you don't want to go on it because you haven't been on it before. And I share this a lot because when it comes to markets, I get a lot of times like, oh, Brad, I don't like the markets. Like I'm totally fearful of it. I'm like, well, are you fearful of it or do you just not understand it? Because that a large part for most things we look at our life is facing our fears is also not just facing it like, in a physical sense, it's also facing it from a standpoint of, hey, I don't understand something. I want to learn about it. By the way, that can solve a lot of social issues nowadays as well, right? If someone's side or opinions come, we just had Thanksgiving last week. We're hopefully thankful and grateful for all the stuff that we have, and we can come together and realize that the common bond, the common thread of all of us Americans is our uniqueness. But if I, look at someone or a social aspect of something right now, and I don't understand it or I don't like it, is it really because I don't like it, or is it because I don't understand it? Understanding it is really a big part here. So, two, face your fears. Because the irony of procrastinating or avoiding specifically in a financial sense, a financial reality, is that it only gives it greater power. So if you're sitting here listening or watching right now and you're avoiding paying off that debt, or maybe even looking at it, and sitting with an advisor to actually walk it through with you is just like too fearful, now's the time to do it. You have to learn from those fears and then actually face them. So open those bills, pay that credit card statement, make a phone call. Maybe it's asking for leniency on those kind of things. I don't know your specific situation. And I bring up the debt situation because I've had a few conversations with clients that are just facing some debt situations. And so it was heavy on my heart, and I want to bring this up. And we're going to go through, creating the snowball effect. That's something Dave Ramsey's done before, and that's something I talked about on an episode, right? Where we build models for those things. Look, what I'm trying to say there is if you seek counsel, you can get out of whatever it is you're in to make sure you find the right path. So it's really important that you bring that up. And these clients I mentioned, they brought it up to me as their advisor. And I obviously knew it was happening when I was building the financial plan. And so I had to say, hey, we got to face these. And that's, by the way, what a good advisor will do, especially as it relates to your finances, because action has the effect of reducing anxiety incrementally, while inaction only feeds those fears. So thirdly, I want to say the last one here, fake it. Okay, hear me out on this one, okay? There is good signs, I think, to look to the adage. My grandfather always told me this, right? Fake it until you make it. We typically assume that our behaviors are a result of our thoughts, but research has actually shown actions drive feelings as much as feelings drive actions. And as for your finances or finance investing in risky assets and setting aside money, maybe for a rainy day, maybe the last thing on your mind is to try to navigate the realities of our new everyday. But I can promise you, the sooner you can begin acting and taking action as you know you should, the more natural it will become. That's the fake it. That's the fake it till you make it. You start doing the discipline, all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, I'm actually doing it. This is me. This is now my identity. So even though you may not be emotionally there or it doesn't feel good, start creating some systems in place that are working toward the goals that you know you want to have. And it will start to naturally become more of a system, more of a discipline for you in your everyday life, really now, and to make it more meaningful. And I think one human element that we all probably can agree on is a crisis or something cathartic tends to bring out both the best and worst in human nature. Now, mind you, these couple items I'm bringing up here around the fear or the anxiety around money and why we need to protect ourselves from ourselves is, again, crisis. It brings out both the best and worst. It's just human nature. I see it every day as an advisor, and I see it in my own personal life too. Just because I've been in the capital markets for nearly 2 decades, right, and been advising clients for about that same time period, doesn't mean I'm immune to my own human traits. As I've shared many times in the show before, Veronica and I, our assets, our 401k, our individual and trust account are managed by the same portfolio manager that manages it for my clients here at the firm for 2 reasons. One, I'm a believer in what I preach, mainly. But 2, I have the same 2 brains as you do, right? I have the same logical, rational brain up top. And in my belly, I have the same emotional brain. And they're competing odds at all times. So, for example, in a year like this, 2022, or maybe let's say a more dramatic one like March of 2020, not reacting as well as you did or as good as you did in that time period, I'm not immune to that. Like I can react as a human just the same. I mean, nothing looks great. Uncertainty is there. So I resort back to my disciplines, which I put in place, what I'm talking about today. But I also have a portfolio manager who I can talk to, who manages the money. So said differently, I like to think I know what I'm doing when it comes to managing money, being in this business for half my life. But the emotional side can wreck all the rational, logical side just the same. That's why I advise that for my clients to make sure you have a counselor, make sure you have someone with you, that advisor, right? Because an advisor like me, I'm human just like you. So, what I focus on myself being an investor in this world is really make sure the same principles and discipline I have for my clients. And just as surely as there is fear, there are more opportunities for service than ever before. So making hardship meaningful is a time-tested way to transform suffering into something more palatable. Maybe it's supporting a local restaurant. Maybe it's buying groceries for a neighbor or write a letter to a service member. I mean, all of these acts will in fact have an effect on turning fear on its head. So make it meaningful. That's the other thing with fear. Make it meaningful to you. Because just because you're maybe going through a hardship, whether that's you got some debt or your cash flows are tight when it comes to money, or maybe you're going through a divorce or something bad is happening in your life, that's disrupting. I get it. Having fear is probably the last thing you want when it comes to managing the assets or maintaining the plan that you're putting in place. Again, fear can be a good thing to keep you from doing certain things in certain areas. That's how the brain is wired. But when it comes to your money and planning, the 4th item I'm bringing up here is making it meaningful. Talk to someone who's going through that same situation, or if you've gone through it, maybe it's a divorce, or maybe it's some sort of cash flow issues, or maybe it's a debt situation. Being an advocate for someone else, even though your own work or your friendships or your colleagues or your family, making it meaningful will actually have an effect on you of turning fear on its head. And I've seen that with our clients, and I share this with our clients all the time. And that brings up one other item here, which is connecting with others. The oxytocin, which is a chemical release that happens when we connect with those we love. This is actually studied by the psychologist, which has been shown to reduce fear. So oxytocin is a chemical we release when we connect with those we love, who we care about. Now, I was thinking about this as I was reading this article, and I was kind of going like, when I talk with a client, I sense it, and I feel sort of a high. I know that sounds weird, but I just feel really blessed to say that I felt a calling at 16 years old, as I've shared before, that my calling was to be a financial advisor. What I went through financially within our own family, I think it was a God-given circumstance in my life. And I see it even 20 years later. I'll have a conversation with a client, and when I talk with them, maybe it's a 3-minute catch-up call, I actually find that I'm happier. My oxytocin was released. In Christianity, we actually call that a giver's high. You have a feeling that when you're able to connect with someone else and give time, talents, or treasures, it's an amazing thing. Being a financial advisor who likes to focus on the human just as much as the numbers is why I'm bringing up this topic today. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, I'm a geek or nerd when it comes to the behavioral financial traits. That's why I wanted to share it today. Lastly, the one thing I've noticed is that we tend to spend our youth sacrificing our health for our wealth. And then what happens, I've noticed with clients, is when we turn 50, 60, 70, the inverse happens. We end up spending our wealth for our health. So I find that this is an interesting one, that we do want to take care of ourselves now, and money is important, don't get me wrong. You want to have your house in order and start offloading that to an advisor who you can trust, who's a fiduciary for you, who does make a difference, right? Because it allows you some free time to connect with others. That's one way, again, how to get rid of fear, is to trust someone. The connection between body and mind is powerful, and in my opinion, underappreciated. I think across the board, we as humans excessively use, things like caffeine or alcohol consumption, which can really only amplify fear responses, which is not a good thing when it comes to making financial decisions. That's why I never go out with a client and have a beer to talk about financial decisions. It's probably not the best time to do it. Whereas exercise or things like adequate sleep all tamp down stressful reactions. I don't have a client coming and saying, let's take a nap first and then let's talk. So we don't do that either. But it's really important to kind of find that balance with someone that you can build trust with. Your mind will only be as calm as your body allows it to be, right? So in these frightening times, or in times that are volatile, which is why I'm bringing this up today. So it was on my heart this last week, talking with clients and just all the items that we've been releasing within the firm around what has transpired over the last couple of years. A lot's going on in the world. So the fear is out there. Remember, the three I mentioned, the fear of missing out, the fear of volatility, and the fear of uncertainty, making sure that those don't meander their way into your investing decisions or really your portfolio structure has a lot to do with actually coming out the other end and being successful. You want to be the team winning the championship, not the team showing up dead last. And the goals, if you think about it, like I mentioned before, the goals are the same for all the teams. The goals for each of you here are most likely the same, having financial security. The commonality is the same for all of us. The fear of money, the fear of the market, and human nature is very clear about what we don't like, what we don't understand. And that's why I wanted to bring up this topic, because the systems and disciplines you put in place now to attack these fears what ultimately will end up making you successful in your financial life. We don't want to let fear and anxiety get into our planning and disrupt us from the goal that we all have in place. So we want to learn from our fears. We want to face them. We want to fake it, believe it or not. If you're not feeling great that day or that week, we still want to keep those goals in place, and because that becomes more natural. That's where the systems comes in. And ultimately, during those downtime periods in our life that we're going to have, the one certainty about life is there will be uncertain things in our life. We want to make it meaningful and connect with others, and ultimately make sure that we're taking care of ourselves even during times of volatility. Hey, before we go, if you found anything helpful today and want to learn more, you can visit us at onecapital.com, or you can scan the QR code that's on the screen right there with your smartphone. It'll get you right there. You can also call or text us. We want to help. Listen, there's no pressure. We don't treat people like a number. In fact, we value relationships. It's the lifeblood of what we do. So click, call, or text us today. If you're not following us on social media, you should be. You can follow us at Make Your Money Matter. We're sharing great information on all of our social media platforms. And as I often say, if you enjoy the show, share with someone you like. I guess if you don't like the show, share with someone you don't like. But until next time, always remember, make your money matter.